What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and this is iRacing 2.0, where today we're going to be taking a look at the 2014 Season 4 updates. Oh wait, I've just been informed that even though this is finally actually iRacing 2.0, it is not actually iRacing 2.0. But you might remember back in 2011, iRacing was trying to rebadge itself in an effort to gain more media attention within the gaming magazines and everything like that, where they like to take a look only at major updates that change the name of the game. And, well, two key features from the iRacing 2.0 updates have finally been completed 3 years after we were told they'd be completed. And that would be driver swaps and team racing, as well as every single car is on new tire model, for better or worse. Yes, driver swaps are now available within iRacing, as well as they've increased the time limit for a hosted session up to 25 hours. There's no day-night transition currently, which means that you're going to have to be racing in the day or the night. But basically, you're not going to see that in this video, because all you do is you click a button to pull the guy who's in the pits out of the car, and then you get into the car and everything like that. There's no fancy animations or anything. Yeah, I mean, there's not much to show off. It's a good feature for, endurance racing within iRacing. It's something that I foresee being pretty much used exclusively within the hosted or leagues section within iRacing. But it's a good feature to have. It's a welcome feature. It's a little bit late, but I can't necessarily fault them, because iRacing is iRacing, and they do have the back-end infrastructure issues to deal with that other sims don't necessarily have to deal with, because of all the licenses and content, as well as driver ratings. And I can see why it took so long, but unfortunately they shot themselves in the foot by saying that it'd be here 3 years ago, when it wasn't even close to being here 3 years ago. And then finally, the final two cars on the old tire model have been updated to the new tire model. And those two cars would be the Sprint car and the Silver Crown car, which I am a huge fan of the old Sprint car. I got into that car, and once I finally got to the point where I felt comfortable driving that car, to the point where I could make it more than 5 laps, man, did I enjoy that car. It was such a blast. It was so immensely difficult. It is so challenging. You had to balance all of your inputs. You had to pay attention. You had to focus. If you watch my videos where I'm driving the Sprint car and compare them to, various road racing cars, it's like I can have a casual conversation road racing and a pretty fast car, like, for example, the Indy car. But going around these short little, uninformed viewer opinion, simple ovals in a Sprint car, like, it's just requiring so much effort and concentration. It's so delicate. It has to be balanced on the throttle. You have to make your corrections. You're constantly working away at the wheel just ever so slightly, just keeping the car from spinning like a top like it wants to do. But the new car just feels like a stock car. It really does. And I've seen other people make that same comparison. It just never feels like that twitchy, sensitive beast of a car that is a Sprint car. It's like this car has 800 horsepower. This car is designed for one purpose and one purpose only: turn left. You look in the real world, and even on the asphalt tracks, you still see that these are not easy cars to drive. They're some of the most difficult cars to drive around, which you might have heard the saying before, at least here on this channel or various other places: if you can drive a Sprint car, you can drive anything, because they're so outlandish, they're so crazy. But this car just never wants to get to that point where you can drive it with the throttle. It just doesn't feel like it wants to do that. And maybe we'll find a magic setup that gets it back to that point. But I just feel like it goes from understeer, 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 understeer to oversteer into smash into the wall. Or alternatively, it suffers from the new tire model issue, which is, as I've called it before, the iRacing death wiggle. It's not a problem to catch a slide. It's not a problem to save a car that's going sideways within iRacing now. But what ends up happening is, if you don't make your correction absolutely pretty much picture perfect precise, you're going to make another correction. You're going to have another wiggle. And then you're going to have another wiggle as the rear tires just progressively continue to lose grip. The more you wiggle, it just gets worse and worse until you actually realize that you're going 50 miles an hour slower than everybody else. But finally, only at that point, when you've slowed down to basically, highway speed, the car suddenly regains its grip and you're free to carry on about your day. And then there's also the fact that it tends to be very, very snappy when you do get a little bit sideways, and you do have a lot of overcorrection, which, in fairness, the old version of this car did as well, plus the fact that this is a small little short wheelbase car with a lot of power. It's not necessarily too difficult to believe that type of behavior happening. However, I do find it happening a lot more with this version of the car. Honestly, a lot of the things I've said about the Sprint car apply to this Silver Crown as well. I don't have as much experience with that car, so I'm not going to speak too much about it in terms of comparing and contrasting the previous version to the new version, but this version of the Sprint car just doesn't do it for me. This is not the same car that I enjoyed, and it's just not a particularly enjoyable car to drive. I just don't care. It drives like a stock car rather than that 800 pound or 800 horsepower, 1,300 pound little missile that was the Sprint car. It just don't care. It sucks. It sucks, honestly. It's such a step backwards in so many regards, in my opinion. Switching gears to cars that can actually switch gears, in specific the GT3 cars. They've done some more work on the GT3 series within iRacing as, well, I think with that iRacing Nürburgring 1000 promotion and sponsorship, and then the Ford GT GT3, I think it's clear that iRacing's really become a very big fan of GT3 cars, and, well, it seems like the GT3 cars continue to get more love as they received some updates. They've gone ahead and equalized green flag running time, so they say all cars should be able to run about 40 minutes on a green flag run from full fuel. That's nice. No more McLaren extended super long distance, super endurance fuel tank versus the roof with its pitiful fuel range because it had like half the fuel tank size, but that's been updated. They've also equalized the fuel fill times, so that way every car should spend about the same time in the pits. They've also gone one further and added in actual pit stop rules. Yay! And by that, I mean that now with the GT3 cars, the tires and fuel are done independently, which this is a real-world rule that's done for safety reasons and tradition, so that way the cars have to start themselves up, and, that aspect of endurance racing. But basically this means that when you come in a stop, your car will get the fuel first if you're taking any fuel, and then once the fueling is complete, the tires will be done. You'll change your tires, which means that if you're taking tires, this is going to alter the length of your pit stop, whereas before within iRacing, the tires and fuel were always done at the same exact time. Somewhat interestingly, they only applied that to the GT3 cars. When the HPD P2, the Corvette C6R GT1, although it's somewhat less of an issue within iRacing right now because that car's been removed from a series where it need to make pit stops frequently. The Ford GT GT2, and then the Roof C-Spec, which they're sort of using as an ALMS GTC car. Those three cars run in the World Sports Car Series within iRacing, which is a sort of wannabe version of the two-door series, with the Riley Daytona prototype thrown in there, sort of in between the Ford GT and the prototype. Those are three cars that are ALMS cars versus one Grand Am car, and they went with the Grand Am rules, which were the same rules that you see in the two-door series in the real world now, which is fuel and tires at the same time, which is significantly quicker, removes strategy from the game. Because it doesn't cost any more time to take tires, which I would really like it if they would go ahead and actually add independent fuel and tires to those cars, because again, it does make the strategy more exciting, because it does hurt you more to take tires than it does to not take tires. It becomes more of a question of which one do you prefer, as well as the fact that that's what the rules were in the real world with those cars. So That's just my opinion. That's my little soapbox, so hopefully they'll change that, although, again, not likely. Back to GT3 cars, though. The McLaren 12C GT3 has received a physics update, which actually changes the way the car drives fairly significantly. It's actually able to look at curbs and not blow up into 15,000 pieces at the same time. It's kind of amazing, actually. But this update has resulted in this car being a lot more predictable, a lot what you would call planted through the corners. The old version of the McLaren was kind of a little bit skitterish, a little bit skittish. You know, it's one of those cars where if you got it wrong, you would get it wrong, and you'd be pretty much screwed in terms of correcting it because of the pendulum effect in the rear end coming around, and steering lock available, and a whole sorts of other things. But in my opinion, it was the most difficult GT3 car to drive. It was the most sensitive GT3 car to drive. Personally, is my favorite GT3 car to drive. But now it's a lot more stable. It's a lot closer to the Z4 GT3 in terms of ease of use and user friendliness. So if you have the McLaren and you want to run the McLaren in GT3, but you haven't run the McLaren because it's a little bit more difficult and you're put off by that little extra difficulty, try out the McLaren again, because honestly, this car's a lot easier to drive now than when I last drove it. That's for dang sure. So honestly, give it a go. I think my weapon of choice in GT3 might just be the McLaren, or alternatively, because I did like the old McLaren because it was a little bit more difficult, and I'm crazy like that. There's the first new piece of content that we'll talk about, which is the Ford GT GT3. There is now a GT3 version of the Ford GT within iRacing that sort of resembles the Maytech GT3s that ran over in Europe a few years ago. I still believe there's one being used in the VLN series, but they've basically taken the already available Ford GT GT2, copy and pasted, changed the rear wing, changed the rear diffuser, changed the mirrors, altered the physics to suit a GT3 car, and pushed it out the door. If you already own the Ford GT GT2 that was previously available, you'll get the Ford GT GT3 as a free update, or if you buy one version or the other, they're sold as a package, similar to what they did with the roof. You'll get two cars for the price of one, meaning that you'll have two different cars to run in two different series if you would like. Honestly, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of this idea. I've talked about this a lot on the forums, and I've said more than enough about it on the forums, but in terms of the way the car drives, it does kind of feel like the old McLaren a little bit. It is a little bit more sensitive. That said, I've also... maybe it's just a change in my opinion as I've played other sims more recently, and I kind of been a little bit away from iRacing in terms of the road racing side of things, and I've sort of just kind of come back with this update to racing road courses within iRacing. But it's like, driving this car, I'm like, eh. Honestly, the car drives like its GT2 brother does right now, which is to say it drives like a three-wheeled piece of dog turd. It just, yeah. It drives like it has three wheels. It almost drives like somebody forgot to tighten the lug nuts on the rear tires. Like, it just kind of like wibble wobbles at times, and it's just really weird and unnatural. But, it does have some of the same qualities that the McLaren did have, with it being a little bit more sensitive, and you couldn't be as much of a madman and get away with it as you could in, for example, the Z4 GT3 at the time. So it's another GT3 car. Whether or not we actually need another GT3 car, I could go on for probably an hour about, but that's what they've given us, so that's that. Okay, I've talked about GT3 cars enough for one video, so let's go ahead and talk about another new piece of content, which is the only track that is new for this update, which is Gateway Motorsports Park. This is a 1.25 mile egg-shaped oval with an infield road course. It comes in both day and night configurations. The road course is currently not available. However, it will be available in the future. There's just a small little hiccup that they had with the road course version of this track, so that'll come out in the future. But again, It's an infield road course. It's nothing necessarily too particularly special or anything like that. I don't expect it to see any sort of use in official sessions. But this is a fun little track. It's a unique track there's really no track that I know of that is similar to Gateway. Turns 1 and 2, like Motegi and Darlington, are a wider radius corners, higher speeds. Turns 3 and 4 is a smaller radius, lower speed corner. Motegi is a really wide track. Gateway, not really all that wide. Darlington, you're always running up by the wall, very small, narrow groove. Completely unlike anything else. It's sort of like a hybrid between a Gateway and a Motegi in a weird sort of way, but it's unique to itself. This track in the real world has hosted various NASCAR races. It's hosted kart races. It's hosted Indy Racing League races. So it runs the gamut, and it should be used fairly decently. I would be a little bit concerned if you're looking to race this car, for example, in the NASCAR Class A vehicles. As during the real world NASCAR season, the series within iRacing pretty much follows that schedule to a T, which means that you only get the wild card tracks during the off weeks, which with NASCAR being NASCAR are about 3 per year. So there's that. But if you race trucks, I expect this one to be popular and be used a lot. It's kind of like a hybrid between a track like Iowa and an intermediate oval. I think this track will have a lot of very fun racing, and I think it'll have a little bit cleaner racing than the short tracks, a little bit more exciting races than the intermediate distance track. So it's a nice little in-between track that I find fairly fun. But then again, I like my ovals to be different and unique, and Gateway is different and unique, so can't complain on that front. In terms of the track itself and its build quality, it's an iRacing track. That's really all that needs to be said. It's accurate, the textures are great. That's what iRacing does. It's not the greatest track within iRacing, but it's to iRacing standards. So, yeah. And then what you guys are probably expecting me to talk about first, and that is the final new piece of content with this update, the Holden Commodore V8 Supercar Car of the Future, which is actually the car of now. I just want to go ahead and clarify because there's been a little bit of confusion within the community. Currently, iRacing has a Ford Falcon V8 Supercar. That is a previous generation V8 Supercar. For you NASCAR fans, think about the Generation 5 car, or what was called the car of tomorrow at the time. For you Formula 1 fans, think about, for example, the V8 era F1 cars. It's a different car. It's not the same thing. The V8 supercars may look the same. To the untrained eye, you would have a very tough time picking out the differences between the current Ford Falcon within iRacing and the new Holden Commodore within iRacing. But they are different underneath the skin, and that's what really matters. As such, they've retired the Ford Falcon to host it in league racing duties, offline testing only. It's no longer going to be used in official sessions. The big differences between the two cars comes down to the fact that the old Ford Falcon had a solid rear axle. It had the fuel tank placed way in the back of the car, a little bit smaller brakes, a little bit smaller tires, a little bit heavier, I believe. Overall, the Ford Falcon was unpopular because it's the Ford Falcon, and that car is always going to be a very difficult backwards car to drive, which is the same thing that you see in the real world with that car. The newer car has independent rear suspension. It still has a spool differential, which means that there is no differential. The fuel tank has been moved forward of the rear axle. The brakes are a little bit larger. In general, within iRacing, that's sort of reflected those little differences. iRacing has already mentioned that they will be rebuilding or building a new Ford Falcon to the car of the future specification to race with the Holden Commodore. That will be supposedly, from what we've read on the forums, the next road car released, and that will basically be the Ford Falcon body dropped onto the same physics from the Holden, because in theory the Holden and the Ford and the V8 supercars should be exactly the same, again in theory, and plus that way within a sim racing sense both cars are fair. Same thing that they've done with the NASCAR Class A vehicles on the oval side of things. The Ford Falcon did receive some updates, however that is not updates to the car of the future specification, and that is why the Ford Falcon is being retired to hosted league and offline testing session duties. So anyways, on to talking about the actual Holden. And I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with the new Holden. When things are going well, I'm having a blast. When things are not going so well, I'm just constantly reminded of just how far the iRacing tire physics have to go. But, you know, when it's going right and you're staying underneath that limit, you're not bringing forward the physics issues within iRacing. Car feels fantastic. Like, there has been times where I've been driving around Bathurst and I've just been thinking, this has got to be pretty much exactly what it's like to drive a V8 supercar at Bathurst. You know, obviously it's going to be a little bit more difficult to drive because you don't have the seat of your pants feel, and the iRacing force feedback isn't particularly good in any regards. But you know, it's like, it feels like this is what you would expect the drivers to actually be doing. Like, I feel like I'm using the same type of inputs that the drivers are going to be using. But then you'll hit a bump a little bit differently, you'll put a little bit too much power to the ground coming out of the corners, and you'll get a little bit sideways. And this is something you see in the real world V8 supercars all the time. And you can save that slide. You know, like I mentioned with the sprint car, you can save that slide and that's no problem. And if you get your correction right, you'll lose your lap time a little bit, you know, as you'd expect, but you'll be on about your way, and there won't be too much issue or drama from there. But if you do get a little bit too aggressive with that, you do try and keep a little bit too much power through that slide, you know, you do kind of a little bit mess up your correction. You're not quite quick enough to unwind that correction to get the wheels pointed straight forward. You'll get into that death wiggle scenario all over again. And, you know, it's just kind of crazy. And it's one of those things where it's like, I think it's a physics issue, but then there's also the sound. You know, the sound could help, you know, help prevent that issue. You know, sound design is very important in sim racing because, you know, it's one of the key factors that we have because we don't have seat of your pants feel, you know. And again, that's something that applies to all iRacing vehicles. The sound is the same. The V8 supercar, the Holden, isn't unique in that regard. You know, the force feedback could be better in helping with that. But overall, I think it is a tire issue, but it's exacerbated by those two issues. But, you know, it's still drivable. You can save it. You can slide the car around. This car doesn't have a lot of steering lock to it. But, you know, if it did have more steering lock, yeah, you could slide this car around and you could drift it for days, although sometimes it still kind of goes into that mode where it just turns into death wiggle fest, and you're just trying to say, whoa, whoa, easy, easy, hold on. And you're just trying to not smash into everything while you're gaining control of the vehicle, and it just feels really weird at those moments. But up to that point, it's so much fun. It drives like a big, fat, heavy tank, and it's just awesome. Like, I literally came down the mountain at Bathurst sideways once and lived to tell about it. And it was cool because I did that, and I was like, dang, I just did that. But other times it just kind of goes into the voodoo zone and just, you know, I think this is a car that it's going to be an improvement over the Ford Falcon. I think it's going to bring more participation into the series. I think it's going to be a more popular car within iRacing than the Ford Falcon was. It's definitely been easier to come to grips with the car and not feel entirely frustrated and feel like this car makes no sense because it's backwards, which the old generation V8 supercars were backwards. You know, it does feel like a more friendly car, and the real world car is a much more friendly car, but at the same time, I still say that this car is very difficult to drive, so you're still going to see participation issues, which means that, you know, you're going to have some difficulties finding a league, because I know some of you guys really need to know about that. You really want to know about that, but in terms of participation, I don't see that changing with the new car. You know, it might be a little bit better, but long term, it's not going to change anything. But hopefully that will improve once we do get the Ford Falcon car of the future, and I guess what should hopefully be the next season, which should be at the end of the year, as this is going to be a short season, which is a new thing within iRacing, I guess. But yeah, so if V8 Supercar, Holden Commodore, it's fun. When it's fun, it's a blast. When it's wrong, it's still just as wrong. But yeah, I think I've pretty much said everything that I've needed to say, so yeah. I hope you guys are having fun with the Season 4 2014 update to iRacing. Bye.